Careful what you say now.
All right. Well, I'm showing a pretty good turnout tonight with about 40 attendees and 5 or 6 panelists. Welcome to the Aging Aircraft Maintenance and Upkeep webinar. And we're presenting this to both owners and maintainers of aging aircraft. And I'm Gary Mitchum, the Airworthiness Fast Team Program Manager at San Antonio. And I also have with me Ryan Newman, who is the Ops Fast Team Program Manager here. And I based this webinar on the National Fast Team resource product, but I have expanded it quite a bit. I think we went from about 30 to 40 slides out to 109. So we've moved it out to between an hour and a half presentation. I hope I've brought in some good information to add to the Fast Team base product. And we also have with us tonight Mark Stefanoff, who's a Fast Team representative, and Steve Dixon might join us, who's a Fast Team rep. And we also have Larry Wheeler, who is a IA mechanic, and Mark Julischer, who is also an IA mechanic in our district. So the presentation is designed to give you an overview of the guidance on maintaining the airworthiness of the aging GA fleet. We're going to look at some best practices for doing that. So we're going to look at the aging fleet. We're going to find out what the world's oldest aircraft is that's still flying. Going to look at factors influencing airworthiness, the aircraft life cycle, 2 best practices for aging aircraft, how and why to do research. We're going to apply Part 43, Appendix D to older aircraft. We're going to look at developing a checklist and an inspection plan. And then last, we're going to look at some of the resources that are available. And I should mention that if I do lose internet connection, I will reconnect. So just hang in there. Sometimes these things do happen. And I will hopefully get back up and running. Purpose of the presentation is to protect your investment if you're an owner. It's to identify defects, prolong the service life of an aging aircraft, prevent malfunctions and failures, prevent accidents, and just basic sharing of information. Couple things to consider. The GA fleet average age of over 150,000 aircraft is 50 plus years old. And as you see the B-52 picture there, it's got 71 years of service still going. And I also located on the internet a nice picture of a Cessna 170A built in 1956. So it's got 67 years of service. One thing to remember is the GA fleet design utilization. These aircraft have flown beyond their the flight hours and years envisioned when the aircraft were designed. And the civil air regulations, most of them were, the certification basis was CAR 3, and CAR 3 didn't really consider the aging aircraft issue, unlike Part 23 and so on. Most small aircraft, regardless of their age, are rarely, if ever, inspected beyond the non-intrusive annual or 100-hour inspection that's required by Part 43.15. And this is what we want you to think about as we go through this presentation. So what is the oldest aircraft still flying? So we're going to try to do that poll question.
Yeah.
I'm going to launch the poll. And there is the question. If you want to try to answer that.
And I'm looking at the answer, so I'll take myself out of the running.
Yeah, Mark, I'd appreciate that. We don't want to skew our results. Okay, so got 100%, it looks like, have answered, and most people think it was 1915. The next one answer is 1909, and the fewest have answered 1929. So that's the way the bars look.
Oh, we're good.
Yeah. Pretty good. Now let's see what the answer is. Well, according to the internet, that's the oldest aircraft. I'm not sure how to pronounce that name, but it's registered. Say that again. Blériot?
I believe it's Blériot.
Blériot. It's a British registered aircraft. There's the registration number, and it says it's the world's oldest airworthy aircraft, built in 1909. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And some of the other aircraft that are in common use here is the Cessna 170 series, 1948 to 56. And I just pulled these off Trade-A-Plane. I thought the value of them was interesting. And the aircraft in the middle there, I actually, later on, you'll see that I did pull the FAA record on that. So you can see kind of what information you can obtain. Here's the 172 series, 1956 to present. And Ryan Newman, our Fast Team Ops program manager. There's his aircraft. Ryan, tell us about your airplane.
Well, it's a 1967. It was actually made in 1968, but all of this model are considered 1967s because they were made for the Army under contract. I know I'm biased, but I think this is the best 172 that Cessna ever made, because it's got a 210 horsepower Continental V6 or IO 360 engine, so 210 horsepower, constant speed prop, 52-gallon drop-in aluminum tanks, heavy duty landing gear, and there's some other features that are kind of hidden around the aircraft, but the Army knew it was going to get a certain amount of abuse, kind of beefed it up. It's very, very good trainer.
Now, how
I've
did
had
you
playing for about 12 or 13 years now?
Now, how did you know that this aircraft was previously in an Army aircraft?
Well, when I finally convinced my wife to allow me to buy an airplane, and yes, I did need permission, I went looking for a Cessna 172. I figured it would be a good aircraft for me to land or learn about aircraft ownership. And it would also be a good primary trainer for my two sons. Well, as I started hunting for 172s, I crossed this anomaly, the R172E. And the more I learned about it and the differences unique to this aircraft, the more I wanted one. I was living in Southern Arizona at the time, found one up in Phoenix, and it was kind of a train wreck. Ended up getting this one, which was near Albuquerque, New Mexico. It went from the Army to the Monterey Flying Club in California, a military flying club. Then it went to two different private owners than me.
I flew one similar to that in the West Coast Civil Air Patrol competition up in Tahoe, Truckee, but it was the one with the 180 horsepower, constant speed prop, and a full stall kit. We were out over the mountains, and I slowed down to the point we were going backwards over the mountains.
Okay. The
Well-
Continental IO360 engine, if you were in a military flying club or Civil Air Patrol or something like that, when you hit TBO, you were required to overhaul the engine. Well, that TBO was 1,500 hours. So most places who do have this airplane, flying clubs or CAP, when the overhaul came due, they went to the Lycoming 180 horse because it had a 2,000 hour TBO and it was less expensive to operate. So there are very few of them around that still have the original 210 horsepower engines.
Well, Mark, since you've flown one, Ryan would probably let you borrow his if you ever need an airplane, which I think you do right now, don't you?
Well, mine's in the shop. It'll be out in another couple of weeks.
All right.
But
Well,
yeah,
I'll
I won the contest in Tahoe Truckee. There were about 30 crews because it was the Pacific Coast Territory, and I won the contest there.
well, here's the sheet on the earlier Moonies, the Mooney Model 20E from 64 to 75. And here's a picture of Mark's Mooney, a 1965 M20E. Mark, tell us about your airplane.
The 65 model came with a Britain wing leveler that was vacuum, and 95% of the maintenance resources now are gone because the guy that owned Britain passed away about 2 years ago, and he had all of that stuff in his head. There's very, very little documentation about how to fix it. Did you want to?
So
Yes,
you
Mark.
replaced the autopilot though, correct?
Yes, 2 years ago, I finally got around to putting, when it got certified for mine, I put a GFC 500 in it. I can tell you that it's a whole lot better because it's electronic and it does a whole lot more things. But the original 1950s Britain or 1960s Britain Wingler that had an autopilot in that you could add on to it, which I had, was fairly good for 1965. The problem is the parts go away and the people that know how to work on them go away. So one of the things that you could notice from the spreadsheet that was up in the first one was the airplane was made from 64 to 75, and in 64 and 75 over half of the production rolled out in those two on. It was down. Okay, the Mooney you're looking at right now, in the next screen, because so you can see all the data there, 5,000 hours on it. It's a 65, so it's almost 50 years old. Oh no, almost 60 years. And it's got about 5 hours on it, so that's a little less than 100 hours a year, and I've flown 50 plus hours a year, so you know what it's flying, not much. It's aging. There's a lot of parts that are tough to get.
All right, thanks, Mark. So let's start looking at some of the factors that influence airworthiness, and of course these, you know, as the longer the aircraft is in service, the longer these things can affect the airworthiness of the aircraft. And so we're going to look at some pilot-induced factors. Ryan, chime in here if you want. I know you have, I think you developed this slide.
Yeah, for me, well, you're showing the first one, hard landings, but I think not just pilot factor, but one of the biggest factors in wearing out an aircraft is training, because new students learn by doing it wrong and getting better and better. And it's the doing it wrong part that beats up aircraft, right? So,
Yeah, so
training aircraft for abuse.
Flight school aircraft really take a lot of, I won't say
Yes,
abuse,
especially in primary training, you know, private pilot training, as opposed to like instrument training.
All right, let's go through this list. Airspeed exceedances.
Yeah. Airspeeds. You get in the green arc, you know, it says that you can yank the controls around as much as you want. You won't bend the aircraft. It'll stall before it'll break. You get in that yellow arc and you start getting in turbulence or yanking the aircraft around, and you will start stretching sheet metal. So yeah, airspeed is important.
Okay, next
Yeah,
one.
but that was true. That was true when it was factory new.
True. True.
The Mooney has the same problem. In level flight on a regular day, I'm up in the yellow area on normal cruise. I got to pull the power back, way back, and slow down to stay out of the yellow arc.
Okay. RPM exceedances are tough on the engine. It's all tough on prop. Not so much fixed pitch propellers, but variable speed props. RPM, high RPM can be those things, the seals and things like that.
Okay,
Mark Julister, you can talk about this one better than I could. Over temps and over Gs.
Yeah, Ken, back to my other comment though, that you can rack the airplane around all you want in the green arc, but that was true 50 years ago. And you know, I could rack my body around a lot differently than I can now 50 years ago. So I'm not so sure about that. But I tell people, you know, I know how I feel when I get up in the morning, so please don't abuse my plane. But no, over temps and over Gs, well, over Gs are cumulative. You know, you might get away with a few of them, but sooner or later something breaks. And when it does, it's often catastrophic. So that's, you know, that if you get in rough air, you want to get well down inside the green arc, maybe try to get out of it. Otherwise, over G is what, being a ham fist or doing something stupid with an airplane.
Over time, you start seeing that with the weeping rivets and stuff like that.
Well, yeah, every airplane has something different that breaks. It's like even on an overspeed, you know, some airplanes you can tell it was oversped because they'll start to cave in and get scalloped. And some airplanes were oversped because pieces of bent and absolutely the smoking, you know, it something needs to be repaired or looked at extra hard. Over temp, good gosh, you know, if it depends on what the number is. Hey, if you get up, you know, EGT up 1500 or so for a little while, well, maybe that didn't hurt anything because it takes a while for the heat to propagate through the engine. If you keep it there, eventually you're going to either cure oil, that can't be good, or you're going to burn some wires, that can't be, or you're going to find that you've reached the limits of some piece of metallurgy somewhere, and then that's usually bad. And I mean, think of the things that take some abuse when you get them hot. Exhaust valves don't like it, and exhaust headers certainly don't like it. If it's a cylinder head that gets hot, well, they're just aluminum as a rule, so they don't like it. But you're liable to melt something, and you know, perhaps all of us have seen melted parts. I've seen a few, but that's a bad thing.
thanks, Mark. Here's another one. Wrong oil used during an oil change or a oil filter not installed properly. And that picture in the lower right corner is somebody installed the wrong oil filter and blew the engine on that aircraft.
And if you guys don't think oil is important, I'll give you an example. There was a helicopter flying in South America. I think it was like in Brazil or something like that. And he got an oil light and did a precautionary landing and realized he's a little low on oil. Town and got oil and dumped it in his helicopter in a turbine engine. And then about 12 and a half minutes into the next leg, that engine seized up, right? Because automotive engine oil is not nearly the same as the turbine engine oil that he should have used. It makes a tremendous difference.
All right. Here's another one, exceeding the useful load for CG out of CG loading.
That's a great photo.
Another one is wrong or soft surface landing. I've seen quite a few aircraft who landed on grass, especially after a rain, and nosed over and caused some damage. Could also be landing on gravel or things of that nature. So we also have mechanic induced factors. Wrong part installed incorrectly, improper torque, non-calibrated torque wrench or not using a torque wrench at all, failing to follow procedures in the manual, or maybe not doing a good inspection, so missing items, parts or fasteners not safety wired properly, loose B-nuts, engine controls improper, cylinder torques wrong, or failing to accurately update the weight and balance after a removal or replacement of an item. Here's just an example of the wrong fasteners being used. The thing is, environmental factors can affect the airworthiness of an aircraft: salt water, blowing sand, snow loads, ice, heat, cold, UV. UV is very damaging. You can get wasp nests in your pitot tubes, mice nests, birds nests, rain and moisture in the pitot-static tubes. And of course, those should be all drained during an annual inspection, drain the moisture. And of course, corrosion. Here's just an example.
Yeah, and Mark Julish told me about corrosion. So just think of it like cancer. Nothing good comes from it, and it's only going to get worse.
Yep. And
Right.
the snow and ice, those freeze thaw cycles are real detrimental. I remember up in Western New York, the freeze and thaw cycles would actually pop the covering right off the little DME blade antennas. Water would get in there, and the freeze and thaw cycle. Next thing you have is the stub there, but no blade, no cover. And aircraft does spend much more time on the ground than it does in the air, so the environment it's exposed to on the ground plays a significant role in how it ages and whether it was hangared or not hangared. If it's been kept outside for years and years, it's going to have more of those effects. Here's a nice map of some of the corrosion areas. Corrosion is the most visible effect that age can have on an aircraft. And if your aircraft spent time in some of those red areas or even the moderate areas, you could see a lot of corrosion. Well, here's a bad example of corrosion. On the left, you see some corrosion on the lower surface of a carry-through spar. This was on a Cessna T210. And on the right, you can see the wing actually came off in flight. And this aircraft had the in-flight breakup, and there was the pilot and a passenger on board. They were both killed, of course. The airplane was manufactured in 1976. This happened in 2019 down in Australia. It went for an aerial geophysical survey flight with the pilot and observer on board. And here is the basic path. You can see the direction of flight. There's a picture. You can see where the right wing was located and where it hit the ground. It flew for 1 hour and 40 minutes before this happened. And the Australian Transportation Safety Board found that a pre-existing fatigue crack in the aircraft's wing spar carry-through structure propagated to a critical size, resulting in an overstress fracture of the structure and separation of the right wing. Here's a picture of the spar totally cracked. There's some pictures of the corrosion pits, and they think the corrosion pit just ended up turning into a crack, and over time that crack just kept getting worse and worse till it just couldn't support the aircraft anymore.
Yeah, and I think, Gary, didn't this lead to an airworthiness directive on the on 210s?
It did. Here's what came of it. A couple service letters. The Australian certification agency put out an airworthiness bulletin. The FAA put out an airworthiness concern sheet. And they even covered the Cardinal as well because it has a similar design. And these service letters required a one-off inspection of the structure and then communicating the inspection findings back to the manufacturer. And eventually, the FAA did issue the airworthiness directive in 2020 for the models G through M. And it required a visual eddy current inspection and application of a protective coating and corrosion inhibiting compound. Some of the lessons learned here are, in fact, in '92, Cessna had a flight hour based eddy current inspection of the wind spar. It was recommended. That was discontinued in 2011. And they did an analysis and they didn't think it was necessary anymore. So they went to 3 annual visual inspections as a recommendation. And the eddy current inspection would probably have identified that crack and prevented that accident. So I think the lesson learned here is Part 43, Appendix D, the scope and detail in Appendix D. That's the minimum in the United States. It doesn't require you to do aircraft manufacturer recommended items. That's an option for the owner to include them, but it is something to keep in mind if you have an aging aircraft. Pay real close attention to the manufacturer's recommendations. So when developing your inspection plan, consider including those recommendations. Go above and beyond the minimum requirements. And, I just asked the question, what if that owner on his own continued to do the eddy current inspections, even though the manufacturer had discontinued them? So, as far as research, I think the safety message here is that aircraft that are flying within their operational limits, but if they're flying with a modification, you see this big magnetometer boom attached, that could cause a lot more stress to be applied to aircraft structures. And even after those modifications have been removed, that stress has been previously applied. And this is a good example of where thorough research would reveal that past eddy current requirement existed. And, maybe the owner would then, or the inspector would say, hey, let's do an eddy current inspection and look at these wing spars. Yeah, the bullet there is the modifications can accelerate structural fatigue or introduce new areas of structural fatigue. Let's look at the life cycle of an aircraft. It comes factory new with the initial type design and all the original factory parts installed. Then that type design can be properly changed by an STC or an FAA field approval. The aircraft remains airworthy, but it can increase stress on the airframe, even though it's an approved change to the type design. That type design can be improperly changed, and the aircraft would no longer be airworthy. Normal wear and tear occurs just through normal use. And that normal wear and tear eventually causes parts to no longer meet their design specifications. Then the aircraft becomes unairworthy. Maintenance occurs to repair the defects, and that airworthiness is restored. Inspections are done periodically to identify and correct defects. Life-limited parts are replaced, hopefully before they fail. That's the whole idea. And then there's pilot and mechanic induced errors during the life cycle of the aircraft that can affect the type design and the airworthiness. Environmental factors. ADs, ICAs, and service bulletins are issued during the service life of an aircraft to correct problems that have been identified. But eventually, just like someday the B-52, the aircraft's going to end up in the boneyard after parts are no longer available, or lifetime limits are reached, or repairs are no longer possible. We've all heard the term beyond economical repair. We're going to look at two best practices for aging aircraft, and they are to do an aircraft records research, and out of that research, maybe develop a special attention inspection. So why do a records research? Well, here's some of the questions that can be answered. If you look at the records and it's had 100-hour inspections, it could indicate the aircraft had been used in a flight instruction environment in the past. And as Ryan said, flight instruction is kind of a unforgiving environment for aircraft. That's a lot of abuse. You can find out if it's been well maintained or poorly maintained. Has the same AI been doing all the inspections, or has it had a different look every now and then? Where has the aircraft been located? Salt environment, desert environment, frigid cold? Has the aircraft been damaged? Has the aircraft been in an accident? What modifications have been done? And these are all important questions that can help in developing the special inspection plan. So the goal of records research is to learn as much as you can about the make and model in general, the history, the service difficulties, the quirks, recommended and required maintenance actions, and also learn as much as you can about that particular serial number that you're working on or that you own. Where did it live? How was it used? What modifications did it get? How was it maintained? And kind of equate that to a doctor's appointment. You know, if you go to a specialist or a new doctor, they always want to see your records, and you always transfer your records over so they can see your health history, operations, the medications, the treatments, kind of your usage. Have you had a rough life, or have you been on easy street? Have you had a lot of stress? Same goes for aircraft, the aircraft history, the modifications, accidents, damage and repairs, and the usage. So to start your records research, you want to start with 91-417, which tells us what records are required, what has to be kept, and for how long. So here's a nice chart, and you see that maintenance records, alterations, and all inspections, those records are retained until the work is repeated, superseded, or for 1 year. Now, most people keep their maintenance log records a lot longer than that because it adds to the value of the aircraft if you have a complete maintenance record. Also, the altimeter and transponder tests are retained for 2 years. And these are considered the permanent records, records of total time and service for the airframe, engine, propeller, and rotor, and the current status of life-limited parts of the airframe, engine, prop, rotor, or appliance, and the time since last overhaul for items that are required to be overhauled. Current inspection status, current status of applicable ADs, and copies of Form 337. And the list of defects that's furnished to an owner if an inspection finds unairworthy items. Those are retained until the defects are repaired. So basically, here's the list of items that you would see that are required by 91-417. And that's what we just looked at. Some of the documents you want to research, of course, are the logbook entries. And that goes for the propeller log, avionics log if they have one, aircraft log, engine log. Aircraft records that we just looked at, the weight and balance, the equipment list, and continuing, airworthiness directives, special airworthiness information bulletins, service bulletins, SDRs, aviation maintenance alerts, and NTSB accident reports. So how do you know you have all the records for your particular aircraft? Usually when you buy the aircraft, you're gonna get a pile of documents, a box or whatever, but how do you know you have everything? Well, you can get a records package from the FAA. So if you do a basic inquiry, if you want to take a picture of this screen, because this is kind of a hard screen to find. If you take a picture, there is the actual web address. And since N numbers change, you might want to make click on the serial number and search by serial number, and then search by make and model and search by N number.
Gary,
Yes.
when you do this page, because I've done it and I got it on a CD, it requires you to put in there with the N number.
Well, on the detailed records search, yes, and that's the next screen. But if you just want to do basic information, you can get some pretty good basic information by using this link. And now the next screen is a detailed records request. So here's the detailed records request. I actually, yeah, you do have to enter the N number here, and it costs $10. And I did the detailed request on that Cessna 170A that was in Trade-A-Plane because I wanted to show you folks what you end up getting. This is the same thing you get when you request it, the CD. But as an FAA inspector, we can get these documents through our computer. We have a database that we can get this information. But so here's an example of the detailed records package on this particular aircraft. I ended up getting 40 pages of 337's airworthiness certificates and inspections reports, 92 pages of bills of sale, applications for registration. Here's some examples of what I found. There's a 337 for auto fuel use. There's some inspection reports. I think those have gone by the wayside over years past, but they're in there. Airworthiness certificates. Application for airworthiness certificates. Here's a 337. I just copied the back side to show you, but you can see here.
Gary, can I jump in for just a second?
Yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
Something that you guys may not be aware of, when you compare the registration data plate on the aircraft to the registration and to the airworthiness certificate, it's not uncommon to find differences, right? Usually it's just typographical error, right? But the three of them should match, right? But it's worth your time to make sure that all three of those have the exact same model, the exact same serial number on those documents, because it's really easy to have errors. Worth looking.
Good point. Now, this one caught my eye because it says it replaced the inboard section of the rear spar on the left wing. I mean, it's hard to read the guy's writing, but I think that's what it said. And also replaced the leading edge outboard section of the left wing. So this aircraft had a major repair many years ago, And this would be a good area to inspect more closely. So when you're developing your special attention inspection list, look at that area more closely. How has this repair aged over time? Here's an example of a bill of sale. And I noticed the address on this is Illinois. This aircraft originated or was first sold into California. And I counted up all the bills of sale, and the ownership changed 14 times on this airplane. So how well did each owner take care of the aircraft? How many A&Ps have worked on it through the years? Remember those mechanic-induced factors. How many IAs inspected it? Where was the airplane kept? The environment, was it hangared or not hangared? And yeah, I found California to Illinois, but I didn't really do a big dive on that. It might have been all over the country. Next thing you want to look at are logbooks. Look in the logbooks, look at the maintenance history, look for missing items, missed inspections, ADs, serial numbers, life limited part replacements, overhaul records, the record of major repair and alteration. That's the actual, not the 337, but the record of performing that alteration. And physical aircraft should match what the logbook says and the data plates, as Ryan was saying. If you see a discrepancy, you really need to track it down and see why things aren't matching. We have a approved presentation called Frankenplane, where an aircraft was hodgepodged with all different parts and data plates and everything else, and they called it Frankenplane. So type certificate data sheets. And if you go to drs.faa.gov, DRS is our system now. And under design and production approvals, go down to the type certificate data sheet link. And you'll find type certificate data sheets. Here's an example off of Cessna 150. Type certificate data sheet tells what engine's supposed to be installed, type of fuel that's supposed to be installed, and the propellers that can be installed. Is the correct propeller installed, and does the data plate match the type certificate data sheet? Here's a data plate off a Cessna T210N. It tells what the type certificate number is. You also want to look at the weight and balance. Is it accurate? Is it current? Is it even there? How long since the last reweigh? If it's been a long time, maybe it's a good idea to reweigh the aircraft. Look at the equipment list. Has it been kept up to date? Here's the old Car 3 equipment list, listing all the basic equipment that is supposed to be installed. You want to look at airworthiness directives. That's mandatory action to correct unsafe conditions. And again, go to DRS. Under the regulations tab, you'll find the AD link. And when you're searching ADs, always try entering just the model with no make, because often the make and manufacturer changes. For example, just as an example, I pulled up the Bell. There's a lot of different Bell helicopter certificate holders, TC holders. So which one do you pick? And as an example, I picked that one, Bell Helicopter Textron, a division of whatever. I entered 206B in there. I only got 2 ADs. But if you do the same thing and you enter 206B, I got 70 ADs. So do a real thorough search so you don't miss something. Also remember there should be an airframe AD listing. Even though a list is not required, this having the AD status is required, and most owners do that by keeping these lists. It makes it much easier. So you should see an airframe list, engine AD list, propeller AD list, and an appliance list. And I often find when I used to do surveillance, that a lot of times they miss the appliances. And the appliances, that's why having a good equipment list is important. So you know what is installed in the aircraft. Another thing you want to look at are special airworthiness information bulletins. And here's just an example of one for the quarter turn fasteners on engine cowlings. Again, go to DRS. And on this one, you'd click the SAIB link. Another one are service bulletins and letters. Normally you get those from the manufacturer, but sometimes from a model's type club. You want to search the service difficulty reports. And that is at sdrs.faa.gov. And you'll come to this page where you can either create your own creator report, malfunction or defect report, or you can search all the reports that have already been submitted. And when you click those links, you either get a create form on the left or a query where you're going to run a search. When you run that search, here's an example, and put in 172M Cessna and do the SDR search. And look, you got 496 records. So this research can take quite a while. And if you're an owner, you know, expect that if you're doing it yourself, or if you're having your IA do a more thorough search, you know, just be aware that it will take some time. Here's, we just opened up one of these SDR reports. This is about the high discharge rate on the ammeter. Notice that this submitter suggested an inspection checklist revision to include a test of the high voltage indicating system. So maybe that's something that you should do. Maybe you want to do that inspection. Aviation maintenance alerts, again at drs.faa.gov. If you go under aircraft safety alerts and pick aviation maintenance alerts, that's where you'll find those. Now, they only were available from 2004 to 2013, but there are 109 of them in there, so I would look and see if any of those alerts pertain to my aircraft. What about accidents? If you want to know if the aircraft was in an accident, you're going to have to go to the NTSB's website and use their CAROL system, the Case Analysis and Reporting Online system. And you want to do an advanced search. And it'll give you a lot of windows that you can fill in, but you want to pick aviation fields, pick narratives, analysis narrative, so that you can really zero in and find only accidents that pertain to your model aircraft. And here, whoever created this slide, they did this narrative for a Piper PA-12. Here's the list. Looks like there were 5 accidents. And if you click on the docket link, you'll pull up the NTSB docket. Here it is. Notice that the second line down has a document that has 9 pictures in it, for example. And there's just an example of one of the pictures. You also want to look and see what STCs there are for the aircraft, especially if you see modifications that were done to the aircraft. Now, some STCs are design upgrades that have a positive effect on aging issues. So a modification can not only create new stressors or accelerate fatigue, but it can also be a benefit, depending on what the modification is. So go to DRS. And under the design and production approval, click on the STC link. And the example for our Cessna 172M came up with 248 STCs. There they are. So now your records research is complete. You've gathered all the information. You've looked at the logbooks. You've made your notes. What next? Well, you want to analyze the data. Relate your findings to Appendix D minimum inspection criteria. You know, you want to ask the question, if I just do the inspection in accordance with Appendix D, is that going to be thorough enough? Develop an inspection plan and consider adding inspections. Create your special inspection checklist. So let's review what most aircraft get. They get the normal inspection as required, and it's done in accordance with 4315 Appendix D, maybe the manufacturer's inspections, Chapter 5, but those are probably not enough for an aging aircraft. Let's review 4315, see what it says. The inspector has to determine the aircraft and portions meets all applicable airworthiness requirements. If it's a Part 125, 135, or a 91-409E type aircraft, that's performed in accordance with the inspection program. And for rotorcraft, they throw in a few more things that they want to make sure get looked at, like drive shafts, main rotor transmission gearbox. The annual N100 hour, it says you shall use a checklist, but it must include the scope and detail of Part 43, Appendix D. And since it says it must meet all applicable airworthiness requirements, and you're going to certify that as an inspector, that means it has to be in compliance with ADs, airworthiness limitations, and life-limited parts. They also go on to talk about engine runs. So engine runs are required as part of the inspection. So let's review the scope and detail of Appendix D. And I've got some pictures of things that IAs in our district have submitted to me, and pretty good findings, I think, that highlight some of these areas. First, it says remove the panels, the cowling, clean the aircraft. You can't inspect it if you can't see it. So important to clean the aircraft and engine. And then the fuselage and hull group tells you what to look at: fabric and skin, systems and components, and it tells what you're looking for. So here's an example of I think that's on the landing gear leg fairing. Notice it's cracked, being held on basically by that gigantic washer. And so that's really not airworthy. It doesn't really meet its type design anymore. Here's a pitot tube that really probably should have been replaced a long time ago. Those things heat you know, that pitot heat can be hard on them. Here's one, I think, I think one of our IAs that are on tonight might have submitted this picture. Mark, was that you?
Yeah, that was me. This fabric was installed completely incorrectly and it was pulling up from the ribs.
Do you remember what kind of aircraft this was on?
Yeah, it was on an Aeronca Champ. Well, I guess it was a Citabria, same idea. But somebody had put the reinforcing tapes on top of the rivets. They riveted their fabric rivets, which is compliant with the type, but they riveted the fabric directly to the ribs and then put reinforcing tape on top instead of under the rivet heads. So it was pulling up an area probably 3 by 4 feet, was pulling up like a cheap convertible top on a car. Sooner or later, if somebody had done aerobatics with that airplane, it would have come out of the sky.
Wow. So that was a good find.
Dumb luck, I think, but there it was.
Next one, paragraph C says, look at the cabin and cockpit group. And you can kind of look at what they want you to look at: seats and safety belts, windows and windshields, instruments, flight and engine controls, the batteries. So let's look at some of these things. Here's one common thing that I've found in my avionics background. These little rubber gizmos that hold the instrument panel. I've seen so many of these that are just broken. I've seen aircraft that every single one of them was broken and the actual entire instrument panel was being supported by the directional gyro riding on whatever the bottom support was. So these are important to look at, these instrument shock mounts. And, you know, anything rubber or plastic has a tendency to age. What about the tachometer? If, let's suppose this tach was reading 200 RPM low. So you might unknowingly be operating at redline all the time. When was it last calibrated? Are the range markings even readable? You know, the altimeters get tested every 2 years, but most of the other instruments hardly ever, if ever, get looked at. Might be a good idea to pull an instrument and send it to an instrument shop and have them test it and calibrate it. I would especially want to know if my fuel gauge was reading empty when the usable fuel was removed from the aircraft. Here's another example of seats and seat belts that have gone beyond their useful age. Now, there's been 28 accidents due to degraded fuel selectors since 2008. And to me, a fuel selector is kind of a high use item. It gets moved around all the time, every flight. And over the years, you know, they wear out. Here's an accident where a PA-38 crashed into a marsh after it lost engine power. And the pilot was seriously injured. Student pilot was killed. The fuel selector was positioned to the right main fuel tank, but the insert was fractured into multiple small pieces. There's a close-up view. And they found that when the valve was in a position that restricted fuel flow to the engine. Here's another one, Mooney M20. Fuel selector handle was loose. I think the engine sputtered, so the pilot switched the fuel selector to the other tank, and still didn't get any fuel and crashed. And what they found on this one was it was just the loose screw. So when he turned the handle, it didn't actually turn the shaft. And so he couldn't pick the position of the tank that had usable fuel. Here's another one. Piper 140, pilot did an engine run, took off, and they heard the crash near the end of the runway. The fuel selector valve was in the right position, but when they did an air test, it showed that the valve was closed. The handle was difficult to rotate, no positive engagement of the detents. When they took it apart, this is what they saw: rotational scoring of the plug cock, some debris, and the detents were worn. The owner and mechanic claimed to have checked the fuel selector at annual, which was about 11 hours prior to the accident. So the lessons learned from the fuel system accidents that I've looked at are: make sure you use the correct fittings, tighten the B nuts, insulate the fuel lines to prevent vapor lock, cap fuel lines during maintenance to prevent contamination, and closely look at those fuel selectors. And there's the list of things that you want to look at. Ensure fuel placards are correct. Ensure the tank is clean. No rags, tools, metal shavings in there. Blow out fuel lines before you assemble them. Check your fuel vent openings for blockage. Repair fuel leaks. Inspect and replace bad fuel hoses. And avoid fuel line kinks and prevent fuel line chafing. Next is paragraph D, which is the engine and nacelle group. There's the list of items they want inspected, and it's pretty vague, but it does give you some direction on what to look for. Notice it says studs and nuts for improper torquing and obvious defects. So really the only way to know if it's improperly torqued is to get the torque wrench out and check it. Engine failures. The FAST team looked at 181 accidents that occurred after a maintenance event, and they found that the most common cause was engine power loss, and the top 3 causes of engine power loss were loose B nuts, cylinder torque, and engine controls. So here's an example of a 210 that went into the bay, and there's the cylinder nut loose. Here's a couple more examples. Luckily, these folks weren't injured. Piper Arrow, the number 1 cylinder separated, and this Ag plane, the number 2 cylinder separated. Here's, I think this might be Mark's too, picture of a cracked exhaust.
Yeah, that was pretty bad.
Yeah, you even had pictures of, I think, the inside of it too, didn't you, Mark?
It was launched out years ago. It came off assessment. Should have probably been replaced 5 or 6 years before this picture.
Here's another one with a clogged fuel screen. This one was an actual fatality, and somebody had used the wrong sealant inside of a fuel tank, and it clogged this fuel screen. Here's a throttle cable that broke and caused an accident. And the Cessna manual says inspect it every 50 hours, and it says replace it at every engine overhaul. Well, the annual inspection had been done 43 hours prior to the accident, and the engine was overhauled 163 hours earlier, but they did not change the throttle cable. So this cable was last installed in '96. So it had 21 years of service. Landing gear group. Landing gear, takes a lot of, I won't say abuse, but they're under a lot of stress. So here's some of the things that should be looking at in this paragraph. Here's one that has a cracked leg. I think this was Mark's too.
Yes, indeed. And that was pretty obvious. I got the airplane in. I can't remember what it was. It was little Piper, I think, and that just jumped out at us. I couldn't believe it was so obvious. It had been flying around like that for quite a while.
Well, They also want you to look at the brakes and the tires, and somebody contacted me the other day about tires, and they sent some pictures of tires that had some cracks in the groove of the tire.
Mhm.
And so here's what the AMT handbook says in the Goodyear, I think it Goodyear manual says if the crack in the groove, if you can see the fabric for more than a 1/4 inch, it's a no-go. Or if that crack gets into the tread itself, it has to be removed from service. And of course, you know, think about aging aircraft and degradation, you know, rubber, plastic, things of that nature certainly degrade. And here's just an example, some of the bungee and the donut style shock absorbers. Mark, have you looked at your donuts? Mark Stefanoff. I
I
think
was trying to get to my unmute. Of course I do. Guess what? I look at those every 50 hours at the very least. And sometimes more often than that, when I crawl under there to put air in the tires. But every 50 hours or thereabouts, and every 100 hours, because of the ADs on that Mooney, I got to put it on stands, and we check the discs to make sure that they're not compressed too far.
okay. And are they available if you need them?
Yes, they're hard to get, but they're available. They're expensive, but they're available.
All right, good. Okay, wing and center section. And here's a picture of the bottom of a Grumman Tiger wing. And I think this is Mark's also.
Oh, yes, indeed. The owner had been flying it for a whole year with a fuel leak. That's all fuel that was way past blue. It was just black and brown and horrible. But he had a running leak.
So on the Grumman Tiger, how are they designed? Is there a bladder in there, or is it like a wet wing with sealant, or what?
Yeah, it's a wet wing, and I forgot what we did about this. I believe we wound up replacing part of the wing. I'm trying to remember now.
Wow.
I don't even remember, but that leak, any pre-flight should have seen or suspected this big stain on the bottom of the wing.
Yeah. And somebody sent this one in. I don't think it was you, Mark, on this one, but this is a vintage Skylane 99 wing root. And the hoses, Larry Wheelock, this might have been yours. You'll have to unmute.
Amazing.
But anyway, and they said that the hoses in the doorpost looked new, but up in the wing root, this is what you had. So really want to look at the hoses and anything of that nature. Here's a 48 Stinson, and I think Larry, I think you might have submitted this one to me. And after seeing that Cessna 210 that had the wing spar crack and in flight, this really, when I see this, kind of scares me to see all this corrosion on this spar. Next, you're supposed to look at the empennage assembly. And we have a couple examples of this. I think, Mark, here you are again. These were some good pictures.
Well, the cross braces in this picture are pieces of pine that had been glued into this airplane with Gorilla Glue. And then, yeah, it was a drywall toggle bolt that was holding it in place where the arrow is. But essentially, the formers weren't attached to the bottom longerons any longer. It was just being kind of all held together by fabric.
Yeah, you can see that one underneath the drywall toggle bolt. Looks like the end of it is kind of rotted right off.
Yeah, this airplane lived in Florida for a long time, and turns out it was getting flyby annuals for several years.
Wow. Here's another one of yours, I believe. where the longerons were rusted out.
Yeah, this guy lived at down at Port Lavaca, and you know, I was doing an annual, and I thought the airplane was good to go, and we were making one last check of the empennage area, but you know, knowing full well that old airplanes can have rusty tubes, I got on a creeper and I took a big old ice pick and I aggressively ice picked the bottom longerons the full length of the airplane, and they were solid. Everything was great. And we looked into into the elevator area there, and I saw a little black spot in a top longeron, and they shoved the ice pick right through it with no effort whatsoever. So it really was. So then we got, you know, a whole lot more careful inspection and discovered that the top longerons on this Piper Colt were just rusted out almost their complete length. So I don't know if it was left outside in the rain a lot or what, but for top longerons to rust out but not bottom longerons was just outside of my belief system, and it kind of changed my attitude about inspecting these.
Yeah, I guess expect the unexpected. And were you able to even save this aircraft?
This airplane is in a storage locker while the owner is looking for a new fuselage.
Yeah, okay. All right, here's a Mooney M20 empennage pivot fairing. I think, not sure what the point was here, if there's damage that I'm not aware of, or if just hasn't been looked at very recently. It's pretty.
Yeah. That was mine. I think it's just a collection of dirt beyond belief, you know, a
Yep.
cup full of dirt.
Here's a cracked tail wheel bracket from a Cessna 140. Looks like the crack goes all the way through the bushing even. Here's a 1940 Taylorcraft elevator cable. Had to be replaced because of the broken strands. 79-year-old airplane, probably the original cable. It has one end that's swaged with the thimble, and the other end is braided. And look at the wear on that bolt, the grooves. Next, under the scope and detail of Appendix D is the propeller group. And we got just a few examples here. Propeller tip damage. You want to look for scratches, nicks, cracks, corrosion that can lead to the stress fatigue. Couple examples.
Ow.
There's a broken hub. And the crack here on this blade, it probably came from that nick. So when you see those nicks, they can end up being and turning into a crack. And we do have an advisory circular on aircraft propeller maintenance. Radio group. I'm going to breeze through this one because we got to make up a little bit of time here. But antennas are the most common thing I see as aging. I see a lot of antennas that really should have been replaced many years ago. All the covering is really degraded. Here's some wire problems that in any aircraft, not just aging, but here's one that's riding on the structure. There should be some clearance there. Wires riding on other wires. You want to separate them somehow, tie wrap or whatever to avoid chafing. Here's one where the grommet doesn't go through the entire, make the entire circle there. So the wire bundle is chafing on that top left picture. Here's one where wire bundle is riding on hydraulic tubing, and that caustic fluid is on the wires. Here's another bundle riding on structure. Here's a bundle that's being sawed with a control cable. And clamping, notice on the left, they kind of missed one of the wires in the clamp there. So it's being pinched. Here we have the bend radius is okay. It's greater than 3 times the diameter. But here, that big wire, it's less than 3 times the diameter. It's kind of like a kink. And you want to make sure any loose ends are cap and stowed properly. Watch out for overheat areas like is apparent on this splice. And as you're looking at the terminals, notice the one on the left, even though they put torch seal on it, they forgot the lock washer. And here's a Molex connector that's obviously been overheated. This should be replaced. And last is paragraph J, which is kind of the catch-all for miscellaneous items. I think that's kind of for all the appliances. So that's Appendix D, the scope and detail. So you might want to develop a special attention inspection based on your research or the type club data or manufacturer's recommendations. And this will be in addition to the minimum requirements of Part 43, Appendix D. Some of the critical areas that they recommend you look at are listed here. And, you know, some you think calendar age related. I think about degradation, corrosion, wiring, electrical connections, seals, fuel, you know, the rubber hoses and plastics and things of that nature. Control cables, like that one that had the broken strands. I've seen some control cables that were really rusted. And that really scares me. Flight hour or use related, think about wear and tear, the landing gear, controls, fuel selectors, servos, and the major attached fittings of the wings and engine mounts. Those are typically never removed and inspected. Don't forget the placards. It's not airworthy if the required placards are not installed, and to meet the intent, they really need to be legible. Instrument panel placards, compass correction cards, fuel filler, and baggage compartments. Now, the type clubs, they may already have a special inspection checklist for your aircraft, and it would be really good to look at type clubs and see what they have. They might have data regarding field approvals for mods and alterations. And to find the type clubs, go to the AOPA website. There's the Crumb Trail, pilot resources, aircraft and ownership, and then the aircraft type club page. And there's all the different links. I just grabbed the Stinson link here. Now, some of the resources for aging aircraft that we have, the FAA, if you go to FAA.gov and type aging aircraft, in the search bar, you'll see these items. There's a best practices guide for aging aircraft and a baseline checklist and a roadmap for GA aging aircraft programs and that other guide for V-band couplings. There's probably more than that. I think I attached a couple of those items to the SPANS announcement that you could download. They're in PDF form. Here's an example of a baseline checklist from American Champion Corporation. And it's for the wing inspection, fabric covered wing. And notice it lists the service letters that pertain to each one of those things. So you've got the component, the service letter, and then you can make an entry of when it was last inspected or replaced. Some other resources available to you are if you go to FAA.gov under the pilots and airmen tab at the top, the drop down pick mechanics. And here's the mechanics landing page. Here's some of the things that are listed there, your ACs, your ADs, SAIBs, and so forth. Type certificate data sheets. and all your forms. Now get your cameras out, because I kind of went through and made up a list of all the advisory circulars that I think are good for owners and mechanics. So if you want to take a picture of this screen, and there's actually 2 or 3 more screens, get your cameras out, take a picture, so you'll just kind of give you a quick reference of, sometimes you don't even know these ACs are available on the item that you're working on. I just highlighted a couple. This is a really good one about parts, AC 20-62. Here's the continuation of the list. I highlighted a few more here. There's the one on corrosion control. There's one on modification of vintage aircraft and preventative maintenance. And of course, the 2 main ones, 43.13, 1 and 2. And here's some more. And the list continues. There's a lot of good information available. And at the bottom, it gives you a lot of information about fuel, AC 150-5230, and that NFPA 407 manual. Here's another list, inspection and care of exhaust systems, seat belts and shoulder harnesses. Now, under the FAA.gov, under the regulations tab, if you pick handbooks and manuals, brings you to this page. And if you click on aviation handbooks and manuals, we have some really good aviation maintenance technician handbooks. There's a general and an airframe volume 1 and volume 2, and a power plant volume 1 and volume 2. And I'd recommend that you download those to your computer, because they're about 600 pages each. Here's the cover of that general AMT handbook. And the Plain Sense magazine also has some good information. For corrosion resources, here's a sample. This is the AMT Handbook General. In Chapter 8, it talks all about the cleaning and corrosion control. And there's the AC on it. Don't forget the manufacturer's websites and manuals. Here's the Tempest spark plugs and the Champion. And of course, the aircraft maintenance manual is our primary resource. I'm just showing the model 172 here, service manual. So
Frank just texted me and says most of those he got in school up in Dallas when he was going to AMP school.
Yeah, the schools I've visited are all using that heavily. So in summary of what we went over tonight, we looked at the factors influencing airworthiness. We looked at the life cycle of an aircraft. We actually learned what the oldest aircraft still flying is, and it was built in 1909. And we looked at developing an inspection plan, and we start that by doing records research. Apply Part 43 Appendix D, scope and detail, because that is the minimum requirement for an annual or 100-hour. But also develop a special inspection checklist based on your data. And then lastly, we looked at all the resources that are available to fix what you find. And always get technical training. There's loads and loads of it on FAAsafety.gov under the My AMT tab is where you track your training. And there is mine and Ryan's contact information. And Ryan, are there any questions in the Q&A?
Well, let me see here. Nope, someone agreed they would love to have a copy of your slides. And another guy said, thank you. Nope, no questions.
All right, well, if you do end up having any questions, there's my contact information. I will get you an answer. And let's see what else we have left here.
Gary,
Yes,
one of the questions earlier had to do with, viewing this presentation. I said it was being recorded, but you may want to tell people, how will they find this presentation after tonight?
okay, once I get it submitted, it'll be submitted and it will live at socialflight.com. But you will be able to find it through FAAsafety.gov under our course list. And once you find it, and then those are all in alphabetical order. So aging aircraft, it might be one of the first ones. But once you find it, the link is going to take you over to Social Flight and you'll be able to view this. And at the end, there will be a little quiz, probably 10 questions. And if you miss the question, it kind of prompts you and gives you the answer. So don't get scared about that. But that's where it'll be. I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. It looks like we ended up with over 60 attendees, which is really great. Really happy with the attendance. And I also want to thank our support speakers here tonight, Mark Stefanoff, Mark Juleischer, and who else did we have? I think Larry is on, Larry Wheelock. And if Steve Dixon joined us, I want to thank him too. And of course, Ryan, I want to thank. And all of you for attending. Until next time, we'll see you around. Safe flying.
Thank you. I'll fly safely when I get my airplane back.
And just so you know, Mark, no offense, but Gary may have been a little premature in offering me my airplane. That's my baby.
I was waiting for you to say something, Ryan.
Oh, I wanted to.
I finally let my son fly my Mooney, but I wouldn't